Hello, my name is John, and if it's your first time here, you're more than welcome. Well, today we're going to be looking at a well-told tale of a lady whose life was, well, a rollercoaster of emotions. Ultimately, she was looked upon as a threat, and at that point there was only one course of action. The country at the time was torn between two differing faiths, one of conflict and betrayal, and one that could potentially lead to civil war. We now look at the short yet tragic story of Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey was the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, the 1st Duke of Suffolk, and his wife Frances, and Jane had two younger sisters, Lady Catherine and Lady Mary. Jane received a humanist education studying Latin, Greek and Hebrew. Through the influence of her father and her tutors, she was also seen as the future of Protestant Reformation in England. Jane always preferred book studies to hunting parties. She received a very strict upbringing, which was typical for the time. Yet she looked upon it as being overly harsh, to the point that on one occasion when she was visited by Roger Ascham, a scholar who found her reading Plato, she is said to have complained.
For when I am in the presence either of father or mother, whether I speak, keep silence, sit, stand or go, eat, drink, be merry or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything else, I must do it as it were in such weight, measure and number, even so perfectly as God made the world. Or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, presently sometimes with pinches, nips and bobs, and other ways, which I will not name, for the honour I bear them, that I think myself in hell.
In early February 1547, Jane was sent to live in the household of Edward VI's uncle Thomas Seymour, who soon married Henry VIII's widow Catherine Parr. Jane lived with the couple at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire until Catherine's death in childbirth in September 1548. She acted as chief mourner at Catherine's funeral, and afterwards Thomas displayed his interest in keeping her at the house. She did return for a couple of months before he was arrested at the end of the year. Seymour's brother, the Lord Protector Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset, felt threatened by Thomas's popularity with the young King Edward, but change was in the air when Thomas Seymour was charged with proposing Jane as a bride for the king. Thomas Seymour was tried, convicted and executed. This was to have ramifications on Jane's life. Her father was lucky to escape the wrath of the King's Council. He had proposed that Jane become the bride of the Protector's eldest son, Lord Hertford, but Jane realised nothing would come of the arrangement. However, then things changed in the spring of 1553. Her father, a member of the Privy Council and friend to John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, had hatched a plan for Jane to be married to Guildford, who was Northumberland's son. For Northumberland, this would potentially become a way to seize power through his son's marriage. On the 25th of May 1553, the couple were married at Durham House. The Third Succession Act of 1544 restored Henry VIII's daughters Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, although they were still regarded as illegitimate. The Act also authorised Henry VIII to alter the succession by his will. Henry's will had reinforced the succession of his 3 children, but then declared that, should none of them leave descendants, the throne would pass to heirs of his youngest sister Mary, one of which was Jane. For reasons unknown, Henry excluded Jane's mother Frances from the succession and also bypassed the claims of the descendants of his eldest sister Margaret, who had married into the Scottish royal house and nobility. When the 15-year-old Edward VI lay dying in the early summer of 1553, his Catholic half-sister Mary was still his heir presumptive. However, Edward, in a draft will, my device for the succession, composed earlier in the year, had first restricted the succession to non-existent male descendants of Frances and her daughters, before he named his Protestant cousin Lady Jane and her heirs male as his successors. The intent was to ensure his Protestant legacy, thereby bypassing Mary, who was a Roman Catholic, and the decision by Edward to name Jane Grey herself was quite possibly instigated by Northumberland. Edward VI personally supervised the copying of his will, which was finally issued as letters patent on 21st of June and signed by 102 notables, among them the whole of the Privy Council, peers, bishops, judges and London aldermen. Edward also announced to have his declaration passed in Parliament in September and the necessary writs were prepared. But then King Edward died on 6th of July 1553, but his death was not announced until 4 days later. On the 9th of July, Jane was informed that she was now Queen and, according to her own later claims, accepted the crown, but only with reluctance. On the 10th of July, she was officially proclaimed Queen of England, France and Ireland after she had taken up secure residence in the Tower of London, where English monarchs customarily resided from the time of accession until coronation. However, Jane refused to name her husband Dudley as king because that would require an Act of Parliament. She would agree only to make him the Duke of Clarence. It was now Jane who had turned the tables on Northumberland. His plans would have to change. For Jane, though, her mind was made up and she would rule alone. Northumberland now faced a number of key tasks to consolidate his power after Edward's death. Most importantly, he had to isolate and ideally capture Mary Tudor to prevent her from gathering support. But as soon as Mary was sure of King Edward's demise, she left her residence at Hunsdon and set out to East Anglia, where she began to rally her supporters. Northumberland set out from London with troops on the 14th of July to capture Mary. If Mary believed she had a right to the throne, she would now have to take it by force. In the meantime, the Privy Council had switched their allegiance and proclaimed Mary Queen in London on the 19th of July. The historical consensus assumes that this was in recognition of overwhelming support of the population for Mary. However, there's no clear evidence for that outside Norfolk and Suffolk, hence where Princess Mary sought refuge. Rather, it seems that Henry Fitzalan, the 12th Earl of Arundel, whom Northumberland had arrested and detained twice as an ally of Somerset before rehabilitating, engineered a coup d'etat in the Privy Council in Northumberland's absence. Jane is often called the 9-Day Queen, although if her reign is dated from the moment of Edward's death on the 6th of July 1553, her reign could have been a few days longer. Events were swift and now Mary had struck, Jane's position had grown ever weaker. On the 19th of July 1553, Jane was imprisoned in the Tower's gentleman jailor's apartments and her husband placed in the Beauchamp Tower. The Duke of Northumberland was executed on the 22nd of August 1553, and in September Parliament declared Mary the rightful successor and denounced and revoked Jane's proclamation as that of a usurper. Referred to by the court as Jane Dudley, wife of Guildford, Jane was charged with high treason, as were her husband, two of his brothers, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Their trial by a special commission took place on the 13th of November 1553 at Guildhall in the City of London. As was to be expected, all defendants were found guilty and sentenced to death. Jane's guilt of having treacherously assumed the title and the power of the monarch was evidenced by a number of documents she had signed as Jane the Queen. Her sentence was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded at the Queen's pleasure. The Imperial Ambassador reported to Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, that her life was to be spared. However, the rebellion of Thomas Wyatt the Younger in January 1554 against Queen Mary's marriage plans with Philip of Spain actually sealed Jane's fate. Her father, Henry Grey, the first Duke of Suffolk, and his two brothers joined the rebellion, and so the government decided to go through with the verdict against Jane and Guildford. Their execution was first scheduled for the 9th of February 1554, but was postponed for 3 days to give Jane a chance to convert to the Catholic faith. Mary sent her chaplain John Feckenham to Jane, who was initially not pleased about this, though she would not give in to his efforts to save her soul. She became friends with him and allowed him to accompany her to the scaffold. On the morning of 12th of February 1554, the authorities took Guildford from his rooms at the Tower of London to the public execution place at Tower Hill, where he was beheaded. A horse and cart brought his remains back to the Tower, past the rooms where Jane was staying. Seeing her husband's corpse return, Jane is reported to have said,
"Oh, Guildford, Guildford."
She was then taken out to Tower Green inside the Tower to be beheaded. According to the account of her execution given in the anonymous Chronicle of Queen Jane and of 2 years of Queen Mary, Jane gave a speech upon ascending the scaffold.
Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. The fact, indeed, against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me. But touching the procurement and desire thereof by me, or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God, and the face of you good Christian people, this day. O God, have mercy upon me.
Jane then recited Psalm 51 in English and handed her gloves and handkerchief to her maid. The executioner asked her forgiveness, which she granted him, pleading, I pray you dispatch me quickly, referring to her head. She asked, will you take it off before I lay me down? And the axeman answered, no madam. She then blindfolded herself. Jane then failed to find the block with her hands and cried,
What shall I do? Where is it?
Probably Sir Thomas Bridges, the Deputy Lieutenant of the Tower, helped her find her way with her head on the block. Jane spoke the last words of Jesus as recounted by Luke.
Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit.
No memorial stone was erected at their grave. Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, was executed 11 days after Jane on the 23rd of February 1554. Her mother, the Duchess of Suffolk, married her Master of the Horse and Chamberlain, a man called Adrian Stokes, in March 1555. She was fully pardoned by Mary and allowed to live at court with her 2 surviving daughters, but she eventually died in 1559. Jane and Guildford are buried in the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula on the north side of Tower Green. Jane was only 16 or 17 at the time of her execution. Afterwards she became looked upon as a Protestant martyr. She featured in the works of John Foxe, the Book of Martyrs, Acts and Monuments, and her popular culture continued to grow to the point of her becoming legendary. Jane died after she had been Queen of England for just 9 days, between the 10th and 19th of July 1553. It's the shortest reign of any English monarch before or since. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this video, then please leave us a like and consider subscribing, and join me again very soon as we take a look back at some more historic stories.